One of the most common arguments I hear from Muslim apologists is not that Islam has been proven true, but that atheism supposedly fails to explain reality. It can't explain morality. It can't explain consciousness. It can't explain evil. It can't explain why the universe exists. Therefore, Islam. I recently watched a discussion at the University of Johannesburg featuring Mohammed Hijab, Hamza Tzortzis, and two atheist philosophers. Although it was presented as a conversation rather than a formal debate, it centered on a familiar question: which is more rational, Islam or atheism? The atheist side focused on two main ideas. First, they argued that the traditional philosophical arguments for God's existence are ultimately unpersuasive. They discussed the problem of evil, religious disagreement, and the lack of compelling evidence that points uniquely toward God. Second, they defended secular morality. Rather than grounding ethics in divine commands, they argued that morality can be built from considerations like human suffering, human rights, rational consistency, and human flourishing. They discussed philosophers like Kant and Rawls, and then applied those principles to Islamic teachings on apostasy, eternal hell, corporal punishments, and homosexuality. Their basic argument was straightforward. If a moral system permits or commands things that conflict with our deepest moral intuitions about suffering, proportionality, and human dignity, then perhaps the system itself should be questioned. The Muslim side approached the discussion very differently. Mohammed Hijab spent much of his presentation arguing for a necessary being, using the contingency argument. He argued that dependent things require an independent necessary reality, and that atheism cannot adequately explain existence. He also appealed to Muhammad's prophecies, claiming that they support Islam's truth. Hamza Tzortzis defended divine command theory, argued that objective morality ultimately requires God, and presented his argument that human reasoning itself points back to a divine source because our earliest concepts required an original teacher. Whether you agree with one side or the other, it was an interesting philosophical discussion, but after watching the entire exchange, I came away thinking that almost everyone was asking the wrong question. The discussion repeatedly became, can atheism explain morality? Can atheism explain consciousness? Can atheism explain rationality? Can atheism explain existence? And I think that's the wrong place to begin. Here's why. Atheism is not a religion. Islam is. Christianity is. Hinduism is. Atheism is not. Islam makes positive claims about reality. It says there's one God, that God revealed the Quran. Gabriel appeared to Muhammad. Muhammad was the final prophet. There will be a day of judgment. There's heaven. There's hell. These are enormous historical and metaphysical claims. They require evidence. Atheism, by contrast, is simply the absence of belief in gods. It doesn't come packaged with a sacred book, a prophet, a complete moral code, or an explanation for every mystery in the universe. This distinction matters because it changes who carries the burden of proof. Suppose for the sake of argument that atheism cannot fully explain morality. Does that prove Muhammad was speaking to Gabriel? No. Suppose consciousness remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in science. Does that prove that the Quran is divine revelation? No. Suppose philosophers never reach complete agreement about objective morality. Does that prove Islam? Again, no. These are entirely different questions. One of the biggest mistakes in debates like this is treating unanswered questions as evidence for a particular religious answer. But they are not. They are simply unanswered questions. Think of it like a detective investigating a murder. The detective carefully investigates 5 suspects. After months of work, he rules out all 5. Someone asks, "So who committed the crime?" The detective replies, "I don't know yet." Another person immediately says, "Well, then it must have been Bob." The detective answers, "No, Bob was already ruled out." Not knowing who committed the crime doesn't suddenly make Bob guilty. Likewise, if someone concluded that Islam has not earned belief, then unanswered philosophical questions do not suddenly make Islam true again. Reality does not owe us easy answers. If Muhammad was not a prophet, then we're left trying to understand reality without Muhammad. That may be uncomfortable. It may leave difficult questions unanswered. But reality does not change simply because we prefer a complete story. This also explains why I don't think atheism should be treated like a competing religion. Many Muslim apologists argue as though atheism must present one unified worldview capable of explaining everything. But that's not what atheism is. Once someone rejects a religion, they don't suddenly receive a replacement religion. Instead, they begin asking questions. What is consciousness? What grounds morality? Does objective morality exist? How should society organize itself? What gives life meaning? Different atheists answer those questions differently. Some become secular humanists. Some become existentialists. Some become moral realists. Some become moral anti-realists. Something morality is objective. Others think it's largely subjective. That diversity is not a weakness. It's exactly what you would expect if there is not a revealed book settling every philosophical question. Personally, my own moral framework is fairly simple. I think morality is much closer to language than mathematics. Some things are remarkably clear. Torturing children for fun is wrong. Slavery is wrong. Unnecessary suffering is wrong. Those are not merely personal preferences to me. But there are also difficult cases. Questions about abortion, euthanasia, punishment, age of consent, and competing rights involve genuine gray areas where reasonable people can disagree. So I don't see morality as completely objective or completely subjective. I think morality has objective anchors, but subjective application. Human flourishing, individual rights, and reducing unnecessary suffering provide a common language that nearly every society can understand, even if we sometimes disagree about exactly how to balance those values. Notice something important. Whether my moral framework turns out to be perfect has absolutely no bearing on whether Muhammad was a prophet. Even if my understanding of morality evolves over time, that doesn't make Islam true. Even if secular ethics continues developing over the next 1,000 years, that does not make the Quran divine. Islam has to stand on its own evidence. It does not get a free pass simply because philosophy still contains unanswered questions. And that's ultimately my biggest disagreement with the framing of this debate. The question is not whether atheism has solved every philosophical problem. It has not. The question is whether Islam has demonstrated that its extraordinary claims are actually true. Those are two completely different discussions. I have no problem saying, I don't know, when I don't know. I'd rather admit uncertainty than accept an answer simply because it sounds complete. History is full of confident explanations that later turned out to be false. Confidence is not truth. Unanswered questions are not evidence, and atheism is not a religion. If Islam is true, it should be able to demonstrate that on its own merits, not by pointing to mysteries that humanity has not solved yet. Thank you for watching.